Hey guys, tonight we begin with the forgotten horrors of the medieval prisons. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me no in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. The story of the medieval prison is not one that often occupies the imagination in the same way that castles, knights, and great battles do. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds might wander to tournaments in sunlit fields, monarchs seated upon gilded thrones, or cathedrals with their soaring spires reaching toward the heavens. Yet hidden in the shadow of those grand images lies a different world, one that few people would willingly think about, but which was very real for those unfortunate enough to experience it. It is in this darker, quieter realm that we discover the forgotten horrors of medieval prisons. To understand why these prisons existed, we must begin by remembering that justice in the medieval world did not function in the way we know it today. There was no standardized system across all of Europe, no singular set of laws applied in the same manner across kingdoms. Justice was often fragmented, deeply influenced by local customs, feudal lords, the church, or even by traveling courts. For many, the idea of being placed in a prison was not the punishment itself, but rather a waiting place until the real punishment could be carried out. A man accused of theft might be locked away not because imprisonment was his sentence, but because he awaited a trial that would determine whether he should be fined, mutilated, or even executed. The prison cell was not always the end. More often, it was a temporary station before the greatest suffering began. Medieval prisons came in many forms. Some were built into castles, tucked away in towers, or hidden behind thick walls. These spaces were not designed with comfort in mind. They were often the coldest, dampest chambers. Sometimes nothing more than basements with no windows, where the air was stale and the stones were slick with moisture. Others were simple rooms in town halls, or makeshift holding cells in monasteries where religious authorities maintained their own forms of justice. In larger cities, purpose-built prisons began to appear. Yet even these bore little resemblance to what we might imagine as a structured facility. The conditions inside were harsh, not out of deliberate cruelty, but because the concept of humane treatment of prisoners was almost non-existent. People were crammed together into small spaces, regardless of their crimes or accusations. A thief might share a cell with a debtor, a political dissident, or even someone accused of blasphemy. The cells were frequently overcrowded, with little to no bedding provided. Prisoners often slept on straw that quickly grew foul with rot, lice, and vermin. It was not uncommon for the air to become so choked with the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste that sickness spread rapidly. And yet, not all prisons were the same. Some prisoners, particularly those of higher status or with enough wealth, could secure more comfortable accommodations. A noble accused of treason might be housed in a chamber above ground with access to light and decent food, while a peasant accused of stealing bread could languish in a dungeon below, where rats gnawed at his toes in the night. Money, as it so often did in the medieval world, made the difference between misery and survival. Jailers often expected bribes in exchange for better treatment. A few coins could secure cleaner straw, access to water, or even permission for family members to bring food. Those without resources, however, faced the full brunt of neglect. What made medieval prisons particularly dreadful was not just their physical discomfort, but the uncertainty that weighed upon those within. Unlike modern systems, where a sentence has a fixed length, many medieval prisoners had no idea how long they might be confined. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, as they awaited trials or decisions that sometimes never came. In some cases, people simply rotted away, forgotten by those who had once accused them. Prison records were not meticulously kept, and some captives, especially those without wealth or influence, could vanish into the system with no one to advocate for them. The psychological strain of this limbo was immense. Imagine being locked in darkness, hearing only the coughs and groans of other inmates, not knowing whether tomorrow would bring freedom, execution, or simply another day of hunger. It is little wonder that despair often took root in these places. Some accounts from the time speak of prisoners crying out through the night, pleading for mercy or praying for death as a release from the endless uncertainty. Food, when provided, was minimal. Many prisons did not supply meals at all. Instead, prisoners depended on relatives or charitable donations from the outside. Bread and water were staples, but often insufficient to sustain health. Malnutrition was rampant, leaving inmates weak and vulnerable to disease. Those without family support could easily starve, and in some cases, people turned to gnawing at scraps or stealing from one another to survive. Hunger gnawed at the mind as much as the body, reducing once proud men to desperation. Disease thrived in such conditions. With poor ventilation, inadequate sanitation, and close confinement, illnesses spread like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, and other contagious sicknesses claimed countless lives. Some prisons became notorious as breeding grounds of plague, feared not only by those inside, but also by the townsfolk who lived nearby. Guards themselves sometimes refused to enter the worst dungeons, instead passing food through holes in the walls to avoid contamination. Torture, though not an everyday feature of imprisonment, often loomed in the background. For certain crimes, confessions were expected, and medieval authorities did not hesitate to use brutal methods to extract them. The rack, the strappado, or even simpler cruelties like starvation and isolation were tools in the arsenal of medieval justice. Prisoners might be kept in dark cells specifically to break their spirits before an interrogation. The line between imprisonment and torture was often thin, with one bleeding into the other in grim continuity. Yet amidst this bleak picture, it is important to remember that prisons in the medieval world were not monolithic. Conditions varied widely depending on the region, the time, and the nature of the crime. In some places, local communities maintained relatively humane holding cells, and charitable organizations, especially connected to the church, provided aid. Pilgrims traveling along well-trodden routes often donated money to release debtors or feed the hungry behind bars. Religious teachings emphasized acts of mercy, and sometimes that mercy found its way into the darkest corners. Still, the dominant impression left to us is one of suffering, neglect, and fear. These prisons were not intended to rehabilitate or even to hold for lengthy terms of punishment. They were places of waiting, of uncertainty, of forgotten souls. And that, in many ways, is what makes their horrors unique. It was not always the deliberate infliction of pain, though that occurred often enough, but the indifference of the system, the way human beings were left to waste away in the shadows. When we read of grand medieval courts, of kings passing judgment, or bishops excommunicating sinners, we rarely think of the consequences that followed those dramatic proclamations. But the reality is that for many, the result of a sentence was not just a fine or a public spectacle. It was weeks or months in the unlit confines of a dungeon, their fate sealed in the silence of stone walls. Their stories rarely survive in chronicles or ballads, for who sang of the forgotten? Yet behind the walls of castles and town halls, countless men and women lived out their final days in darkness. And it is their silence that forms the backdrop of the medieval world we think we know. This, then, is where we begin, in the damp corridors and locked chambers of medieval prisons, where hope was a fragile thing, and life was often measured not in freedom, but in how long one could endure. If you close your eyes and try to imagine the day-to-day rhythm of life inside a medieval prison, what might come to mind first? For most, it would be the silence, the stillness, the sense of isolation behind locked doors. Yet in truth, medieval prisons were rarely quiet. They were places of noise, confusion, and ceaseless discomfort. Chains rattled as prisoners shifted positions on the floor. Coughing echoed through the stone chambers, and the cries of those suffering in the darker corners reverberated off the walls. Life inside these spaces was an unending chorus of human misery. For those who entered such prisons, the transition from freedom to confinement was immediate and jarring. A man arrested in a marketplace for theft or debt might be seized by guards, marched through the streets, and thrown into a cell with little ceremony. The door would shut behind him, and he would suddenly find himself surrounded by strangers, some hardened criminals, others simply unlucky souls awaiting trial. There was rarely segregation by crime or by age. A young boy accused of petty mischief could share space with a murderer. The mingling of so many types of prisoners only increased the dangers, for violence among inmates was a constant threat. The conditions varied depending on the architecture of the prison itself. In some towns, dungeons were little more than pits dug beneath the ground, where prisoners were lowered and left in the dark. These were known as oubliettes, from the French word oubliette, meaning to forget. And indeed, that was often their purpose, to place someone out of sight and out of mind, leaving them to languish until death claimed them. In other prisons, the cells were carved into the thick walls of a fortress, narrow chambers with iron bars that permitted only a sliver of light. Even in more developed facilities, the sense of airlessness and confinement hung heavily, pressing on the mind as much as the body. What sustained the prisoner through such ordeals was not comfort, but endurance. Those who had families fared better, for relatives could often bring food and supplies if allowed by the jailer. The importance of outside support cannot be overstated, for without it, survival was unlikely. A loaf of bread from a wife or a flask of watered ale from a friend could mean the difference between life and death. Some communities took pity on those without families and provided alms, but such acts of charity were far from guaranteed. The role of the jailer, too, must be understood. In many cases, the jailer was not merely a guard, but an entrepreneur of sorts. His income depended not on a steady wage, but on fees and bribes from prisoners. He might charge for bedding, for food, or even for the removal of shackles. Wealthy prisoners could negotiate for privileges, separate cells, access to clean clothing, or the opportunity to walk in the yard. Poor prisoners, by contrast, received only the bare minimum, if that. The cruelty of the system was not always deliberate malice, but an indifference shaped by money and necessity. There are records from medieval towns that describe the atmosphere of these prisons with unsettling clarity. In London, for example, the notorious Newgate prison became infamous for its squalid conditions. Inmates were crammed together in filthy rooms, and disease spread so easily that it was said even the jailers dreaded entering. One account from the 14th century describes how prisoners begged through the bars for food, extending their hands to passers-by in the hope of a coin or a scrap. The prison became a place of public spectacle, where townsfolk might walk by not just to witness justice, but to see the wretched condition of those within. The physical structure of these prisons played a role in amplifying their horrors. Stone walls absorbed moisture, leaving everything damp. Wooden doors swelled and creaked, iron bars rusted, and straw bedding quickly decayed. Vermin thrived in the dark, feeding on scraps and, at times, on the prisoners themselves. Accounts speak of rats bold enough to scurry across bodies in the night, gnawing at sores or unattended wounds. Fleas and lice were unavoidable, crawling over skin and burrowing into hair, spreading sickness with every bite. Punishment within the prison often extended beyond mere confinement. Shackles, manacles, and stocks were employed not just for security, but as a constant reminder of subjugation. Prisoners might be chained to walls, their movements restricted to a few steps. In some cases, chains were deliberately heavy, designed to strain the body and cause constant discomfort. The pressure of iron against skin created sores, and infections followed quickly. Freedom of movement, so often taken for granted, became a distant memory for those bound in such a way, and yet, despite this suffering, there were moments of strange routine. Prisoners developed ways to pass the time, however grim. Some carved marks into the stone walls to measure the days. Others whispered prayers or sang hymns to soothe themselves. Those who could write sometimes composed letters or poems, though parchment and ink were rare luxuries. Conversation became a lifeline. Inmates shared stories of their lives before imprisonment, tales of villages and farms left behind, dreams of freedom they might never see again. These fragments of human connection offered fleeting comfort in a world otherwise dominated by despair. It is easy to assume that imprisonment was only for the common people, but nobles and high-ranking figures also found themselves behind bars from time to time. When political rivalries turned sour or accusations of treason arose, even knights and lords could be confined. Their experiences, however, differed greatly. A noble prisoner might be granted a chamber with a bed, allowed to receive visitors, and even provided with meals suitable to his rank. His confinement was as much about honor as punishment. But the commoner thrown into a dungeon below ground had no such privilege. The contrast between these experiences highlights the deep inequalities of medieval society. One of the most haunting aspects of medieval imprisonment was the lack of clear endings. For many, there was no sense of how long they would remain behind bars. Some might be released after paying fines or proving their innocence, while others might be left for years until their bodies wasted away. Death came often, not from execution, but from neglect. Skeletons have been found in old dungeon sites, their bones still bearing the marks of shackles, suggesting they died where they were chained. The silence of their end, the absence of record or remembrance, is perhaps the greatest horror of all. Still, not all was despair. Some prisoners managed to escape. Stories of daring breakouts appear throughout medieval chronicles. A file smuggled in by a friend, a rope lowered from a sympathetic window, or even sheer determination could sometimes overcome the bars and walls. These escapes, though rare, became legends retold with awe. They reminded others that even in the darkest confinement, the human will to be free burned brightly. But for the vast majority, escape was impossible. They endured day after day, watching as fellow prisoners grew weaker and disappeared. The rhythm of life became one of waiting for food, waiting for news, waiting for release or punishment. The passing of time itself became a kind of torment, each hour stretching endlessly into the next dot. And so, when we think of medieval prisons, we must not imagine them as distant curiosities, but as lived realities for countless men and women. Behind the grandeur of castles and the solemnity of cathedrals lay these hidden chambers of suffering. They were part of the fabric of medieval life, shaping how justice was perceived and how fear was maintained. They were reminders that power was not only displayed on the battlefield or in the throne room, but also in the darkness of the dungeon, where silence and neglect crushed the spirit as surely as any sword. If one wishes to truly understand the medieval prison, it is helpful to examine some of the most notorious examples, for each had its own character, its own reputation, and its own particular form of misery. The names of these places have lingered across centuries, whispered in chronicles and remembered in folklore as symbols of suffering, corruption, and cruelty. Among the most infamous was Newgate Prison in London. Established as early as the 12th century, Newgate grew into one of the largest and most feared prisons of medieval England. Its walls were high, its gates thick, and its reputation dark. The prison was built into the very structure of London's city wall, looming above the streets like a brooding sentinel. Inside, conditions were appalling. Reports from the time describe cells packed so tightly with inmates that there was little room to lie down. The stench of human waste was overwhelming, for sanitation was minimal and disease rampant. Typhus, later known as jail fever, spread quickly, cutting down prisoners and even judges who came into contact with them during trials. But Newgate was not simply a holding place for criminals awaiting punishment. It became a world of its own, with a hierarchy among the prisoners. Those with money could buy privileges, bribing jailers for better treatment, while the poor languished in filth. Contemporary accounts tell of garnish, a fee demanded from new arrivals by fellow inmates. If the prisoner could not pay, he might be beaten or tormented until he submitted. Thus, even within the prison walls, there was exploitation, a miniature society with its own rules of power and control. Another prison of dread was the Tower of London, though its nature was somewhat different. The Tower was not a common prison for thieves or debtors, but a place reserved for high-profile captives, rebellious nobles, political enemies, and figures of importance. Its dungeons and chambers became the backdrop for some of the most dramatic imprisonments in English history. Famous prisoners included Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, and even princes of royal blood. For many, confinement in the Tower ended not with release, but with execution upon the Green or at nearby Tower Hill. Yet the Tower, unlike the squalid dungeons of Newgate, often offered its prisoners relative comfort. Nobles were sometimes housed in furnished rooms, permitted to have servants, and granted access to reading or writing materials. Still, the fear of what awaited them often weighed more heavily than the chains themselves. The walls of the Tower bore witness to whispered prayers, desperate plotting, and the quiet despair of those who knew their fate was sealed. On the continent, the Bastille in Paris became another symbol of imprisonment, though its notoriety grew greater in later centuries. Even in the medieval era, however, the Bastille's thick walls and looming towers represented the absolute power of monarchy. To be taken there was not simply to be confined, but to be silenced, hidden from society, swallowed by the state. Like the Tower of London, it was used not only for criminals, but for political prisoners, men and women whose voices or actions threatened authority. Its cells were cold, its corridors long, and the sense of hopelessness profound beyond these great prisons of state power. There were countless smaller dungeons scattered across Europe. Each castle, each fortified town, possessed some form of holding cell. Many of these were crude stone pits dug into the earth, barred rooms in gatehouses, or chambers beneath towers. These were rarely intended for long-term confinement. Instead, there were temporary places where prisoners awaited trial, punishment, or ransom. Yet for those who found themselves inside, even a short stay could be torment enough. An especially cruel form of imprisonment was the oubliette, which we touched on earlier. This type of dungeon was deliberately designed to erase the prisoner from memory. Narrow shafts were cut into the ground, sometimes so tight that the prisoner could not even sit, forcing them to stand in darkness. Food, if provided, was lowered down in baskets, but often the prisoner was left simply to starve. The purpose was not justice, but disappearance. Many castles across France, Germany, and England contained such oubliettes. Their openings hidden in floors, their depths shrouded in shadow. The very name reminds us of the ultimate cruelty, to be forgotten. The role of church prisons also deserves attention. The medieval church held immense power, and with that power came its own systems of justice. Ecclesiastical prisons, often attached to monasteries or cathedrals, confined those who broke church law. Heretics, defiant monks, and even clergy accused of corruption might be locked away. While these prisons sometimes offered less brutality than secular ones, they were no less feared. For those accused of heresy, imprisonment could be the prelude to far harsher punishments, including torture and execution. Inquisitors used confinement not only as a penalty but as a tool of control, pressing the accused toward confession. The silence of the cloister walls echoed with the whispered prayers of those who hoped for mercy. Not all stories from medieval prisons end in death or despair. Some accounts record remarkable escapes. At the Tower of London, Ranulph Lambard, Bishop of Durham, achieved one of the most famous breakouts. Imprisoned for extortion under King Henry I, he managed to smuggle in a rope hidden inside a wine cask. After a drunken feast with his guards, he slipped away and descended from the tower walls, escaping into the night. Such tales became legend, feeding the imaginations of those trapped within their own cells. The dream of escape was perhaps the most powerful antidote to despair. There were also prisoners who managed to write from within their cells, leaving behind voices that still speak to us today. One such voice is that of Boethius, a Roman philosopher imprisoned in the early medieval period. Though not confined in the dark pits of later dungeons, he nonetheless experienced the silence of captivity, and in that silence he composed the consolation of philosophy. His reflections on fate, fortune, and endurance remind us that even in confinement, the human mind could reach toward truth and meaning. What strikes us most, when we consider these examples, is the variety of experiences. Imprisonment in the medieval world was not a single, uniform thing, but a spectrum ranging from the filth of Newgate to the political intrigue of the Tower, from the religious discipline of monastic cells to the hidden depths of the oubliette. Yet in every case, the thread of suffering runs through. For the commoner, the noble, the heretic, or the thief, to be imprisoned was to be diminished, to be stripped of dignity, and to be made subject to forces beyond one's control. When we walk today through the ruins of castles, or stand before the preserved towers of old prisons, It is tempting to view them only as architecture, as relics of a distant time. But behind those stones lie the memories of countless men and women whose lives ended in misery. The scratches on the walls, the rust on the bars, the narrow slits of light ore, these are the remnants of human suffering. They speak quietly, but insistently, reminding us that justice in the medieval age was as much about power and fear as it was about law. And so, as we reflect upon these prisons, we see more than just physical spaces. We see symbols of control, reminders of how societies sought to maintain order through fear. Yet we also see resilience. For in every tale of horror, there is also a whisper of endurance. A prisoner who prayed, who sang, who carved his name into stone to prove he had lived. The forgotten horrors of medieval prisons are, in truth, stories of human survival, though survival often came at the cost of great suffering. As we move further into the world of medieval prisons, it becomes clear that the physical suffering was only one part of the ordeal. Perhaps just as devastating was the psychological toll. To be confined in darkness, isolated from family, uncertain of one's fate, was to live with a constant gnawing dread. Prisoners spoke of time stretching endlessly, each hour marked only by the dim change of light seeping through cracks in the stone, or by the sounds echoing from above footsteps of guards, distant bells, muffled voices of others who remained out of sight. In this environment, the mind itself often became the prisoner's greatest tormentor. Deprivation of human contact bred despair. Those left for weeks or months without conversation slipped into madness. Accounts from chroniclers describe prisoners talking to rats or scratching crude drawings into the walls as a way to keep hold of their sanity. The scratching was not merely graffiti, but a desperate attempt to assert existence, to leave a mark against the erasure of time. Even in death, many of these marks survive, faint but visible, reminders of the individuals who once stared at those same walls for days without end. The psychological strain was compounded by uncertainty. Unlike modern systems with defined sentences, medieval imprisonment was often open-ended. A man might languish for years without trial, awaiting judgment that might never come. Others knew that their prison term was only the prelude to something worse: execution, mutilation, or exile. The walls of the cell became a purgatory, a place between freedom and final punishment. That anticipation, that knowledge of an uncertain but likely grim future, eroded even the strongest spirits. The connection between prisons and executions was particularly strong in the medieval period. Prisons were not usually intended to house offenders for life. Instead, they were holding places where the accused waited until the law, the ruler, decided their fate. A thief might be kept until his public hanging, a debtor until his family could pay, a nobleman until ransom was arranged. In this way, imprisonment was less a punishment itself and more a stage in the process of justice. Though the suffering endured during that stage was often punishment enough. Public executions were carefully staged events, and prisons played their part in these spectacles. Prisoners were led from their cells through the streets to the scaffold or gallows, paraded before the crowd as both warning and entertainment. The grim procession itself was a ritual, designed to emphasize the authority of law and the power of rulers. Those who had spent months or years in confinement were often barely recognizable by the time they faced the crowd, emaciated, pale, and broken in body, if not in spirit. Their appearance added to the drama of the moment, reinforcing the lesson that defiance of law carried terrible consequences. The intertwining of prison and punishment can also be seen in the practice of torture. which often took place within the prison walls. Torture was not considered a punishment in itself, but a tool to extract confession or information. Still, for the victim, the line was meaningless. Pain inflicted in a cell was as real as pain inflicted in the square. Devices such as the rack, the thumbscrew, and the strappado were stored in dungeons, and many prisoners, especially those accused of heresy, endured their torments in the same chambers where they were confined. This blending of imprisonment and torture made the dungeon a place of dread even beyond its physical hardships. At the same time, prisons had a symbolic function in medieval society. They were visible reminders of authority. A castle dungeon demonstrated the Lord's power to control and punish. A city jail showed the community's determination to enforce order. Even monastic cells reflected the church's ability to discipline its own. The very existence of these prisons reinforced the structures of power that defined the age. And yet, their horrors also lingered in the minds of the people, creating fear that discouraged rebellion or disobedience. The symbolism extended beyond fear alone. In medieval literature, imprisonment often became a metaphor for sin, for the bondage of the soul. Poets and theologians likened the dungeon to the darkness of spiritual ignorance or the confinement of earthly desire. To be released from prison was akin to salvation. These symbolic readings remind us that prisons were not only physical realities, but also cultural symbols, shaping the imagination of the age. It is worth noting that not every medieval prison was a place of complete despair. For wealthy or influential prisoners, there could be comforts. Some enjoyed reasonably good food, access to books, or the company of servants. But even for them, the uncertainty of fate and the stigma of confinement weighed heavily. A noble knight, once accustomed to open fields and freedom, might find the very restriction of movement unbearable. The bars on the window, no matter how gilded the chamber, were still bars. And what of the jailers themselves, the men who guarded the doors and held the keys? They were part of the prison world too, often living within the same buildings, subject to the same stench and dangers of disease. Many grew corrupt, demanding bribes from prisoners or their families in exchange for better treatment. Yet others were indifferent or even sympathetic, caught between their duties and the suffering they witnessed daily. The prison was thus not merely a place of punishment, but also a workplace, one that exposed its keepers to the same atmosphere of misery that defined the lives of the imprisoned. Over time, the memory of these prisons accumulated, shaping how later generations thought of the medieval age itself. Tales of oubliettes, of chains clinking in darkness, of prisoners forgotten until death claimed them all became part of the popular imagination of the Middle Ages. Even today, when tourists step into the damp cells of old castles, they feel the chill of that past, sensing that the stones themselves carry echoes of the suffering once endured there. This enduring fascination, perhaps, tells us something important. Medieval prisons were not merely places of cruelty. They were also mirrors of the societies that built them. They reflected systems of law, structures of power, and attitudes toward crime and order. To study them is to glimpse the values of the time values that mingled justice with vengeance, authority with fear, and discipline with despair. As we conclude this first segment of our journey, the forgotten horrors of medieval prisons come into sharper focus. They were not forgotten by those who endured them, nor by those who watched prisoners led to their fate. They were places where the body was confined, the spirit tested, and society's power made manifest in stone and iron. They remind us that history is not only about kings and battles, but also about the countless men and women who lived and died behind locked doors. Their voices faint, but still present in the echoes of stone walls. And so, the story of medieval prisons is not one of architecture alone, nor of law alone, but of human endurance in the face of confinement. It is a story of despair, but also of resilience, of silence broken by whispered prayers, and of lives that, though diminished, still left traces for us to uncover. To walk among those stones today is to listen for those voices, and to remember that within every wall once beat a human heart. When we move deeper into the world of medieval punishment, the prison cell itself often acted not as the end of justice, but as its prelude. The stone walls were not the conclusion of a sentence, but the waiting room for something darker. To understand the forgotten horrors of these prisons, we must now shift from the confinement of the cell to the punishments that awaited those within. The medieval world functioned on spectacle. Law was not an invisible force written in thick books and enforced through quiet bureaucracies. It was a living, breathing display, meant to be seen and remembered. For this reason, punishment was rarely hidden away. Instead, it was staged to capture the eyes and ears of the community. Public squares, markets, and city gates became stages upon which prisoners, dragged from their dungeons, faced the verdict of society. And for those who had spent days or years in the dark confines of a jail, the sudden exposure to the roar of a crowd was overwhelming. Hanging was one of the most common punishments. Its simplicity required little more than a rope, a beam, or a tree. For the condemned, the long wait in prison made the moment of execution a grim certainty. The prisoner might spend sleepless nights imagining the sound of the crowd, the feel of the rope, the drop into air. When the day came, guards would haul him from his cell, bind his hands, and march him through streets crowded with onlookers. The people who watched did not always do so with malice. Some came for justice, others for curiosity, and many simply because public execution was one of the few spectacles of their age. The prison played its part in this ritual. It held the body in readiness, softened it with deprivation, and prepared the soul for judgment. A prisoner weakened by cold, hunger, and disease was already broken before the rope tightened around his neck. And though the act of execution lasted only moments, the memory of the prison stayed etched into the condemned's final hours. Not all punishments ended in death. For lesser crimes, mutilation or branding were common. Fingers were chopped, ears sliced, cheeks seared with hot irons. These punishments carried a practical logic. They left the offender alive, but marked for life, visible proof of transgression. Many of these mutilations were performed outside the very walls of the prison, with jailers and guards ensuring the prisoner's presence. The jail was not just a container, it was an antechamber to pain, the place from which a marked man emerged, forever altered. Torture, though not as universally applied as popular imagination suggests, did play a role, particularly in cases of treason or heresy. Within prison chambers, the accused was sometimes stretched on racks until joints cracked, hoisted by their arms until shoulders dislocated, or bound with crushing devices designed to elicit confession. For those in the dungeon, the sound of chains clinking, the echo of screams, was enough to seed terror in the minds of all. Many did not need to be tortured themselves. The knowledge that it might happen was sufficient to break wills. The cruelty of these practices might seem barbaric, but they were rooted in the society of their time. Law was not only about punishing the guilty, it was about reinforcing order. In an age when kings ruled by divine right and lords by birth, disobedience threatened the stability of the entire structure. Punishments had to be visible, prisons had to be harsh, and justice had to be remembered. Fear was not merely a byproduct, it was the intention. Yet punishment could also be strangely theatrical. In some towns, convicted criminals were forced to wear shame masks, grotesque iron contraptions shaped like animals or demons paraded before the crowd as a warning and a humiliation. Others were set in pillories or stocks, wooden devices that immobilized the head and arms, leaving the prisoner exposed to the mockery or abuse of passers-by. For days, the offender might endure rotten vegetables, insults, and laughter until released. These punishments were as much about social shame as physical suffering, and the prison cell once again became the holding pen where the offender awaited this public ordeal. Consider also the role of religion. Medieval punishment was often tied to the salvation of the soul. A heretic imprisoned in a dungeon might be offered the chance to repent, confess, and return to the church. Torture, harsh as it was justified by some authorities as a way of saving the condemned from eternal damnation. In this view, the dungeon was not only a place of darkness, but also a crucible for repentance. The prisoner was broken not only for the crime against law, but for the imagined crime against God. The interplay between prison, punishment, and faith added layers of meaning to the horrors endured. The walls did not only represent confinement, they were symbolic of sin, the weight of the soul shackled to its own transgressions. When a prisoner emerged, broken and scarred, society saw not only a criminal but a sinner marked by divine justice. This fusion of religion and law meant that every punishment carried a sacred resonance in the midst of this. The experience of prisoners themselves varied widely. Some, especially the poor, endured the full brutality of the system, but others, wealthy nobles or politically useful captives, sometimes managed to mitigate their suffering. Ransom payments, family influence, or noble birth might secure a more comfortable imprisonment. In such cases, the punishments could be softened and the dungeon replaced by guarded rooms within a castle or monastery. Yet even these privileged captives lived with uncertainty, their fate dependent on the shifting currents of politics. For the majority, however, there was no such relief. The prison cell remained dark, damp, and filled with dread. Punishment was never far away, its echoes carried by rumor and sound, its reality marked by scars and corpses. To live in a medieval prison was to exist in a world where every sound might signal the approach of guards. Every sunrise might bring trial or torture. Every day might be one's last. What is most haunting is not only the brutality, but the ordinariness of it. For medieval society, these punishments were part of daily life. Children grew up watching prisoners in stocks. Merchants walked past dungeons on their way to market. Monks heard confessions of captives. Lords issued commands to jailers. The forgotten horrors of prisons were woven into the fabric of life, as natural to the people of the time as taxes, harvests, or war. And so, as we enter the second segment of this narrative, we see more clearly how prisons functioned within a larger system of punishment. They were not isolated cells of suffering, but integral to a society that demanded visible justice. The walls did not only confine, they prepared. They held bodies ready for the rope, the flame, the blade, or the crowd. They created anticipation, despair, and dread, ensuring that the punishment, when it came, had already begun long before the prisoner stepped outside. If the cell was the waiting place and the public square the stage of punishment, then there was spaces in between where pain was cultivated with careful precision. These were the torture chambers, tucked deep inside castles, fortresses, and city jails, where prisoners were stripped not only of their freedom but of their dignity, their resistance, and often their confessions. To modern eyes, these chambers seem almost mythical in their cruelty, and yet for medieval people, they carried a chilling but practical purpose. The architecture of such spaces reflected their function. Thick stone walls prevented sound from carrying. Iron rings were set into floors and ceilings to hold ropes, chains, and devices. Torches burned against damp walls, their smoke clinging to the low ceilings. The air was heavy with sweat, fear, and the metallic temps of iron heated in flames. Prisoners often smelled the chamber before they ever saw it. The stench of scorched metal, moldy wood, and human suffering clinging like a living shadow. One of the most notorious instruments was the rack. Constructed of a wooden frame fitted with rollers, it was deceptively simple. A prisoner, tied by wrists and ankles, was slowly stretched as the rollers were turned. With each pull, joints strained, tendons snapped, and bones cracked. Confessions often poured forth not from guilt but from the overwhelming need to end the torment. The dungeon keeper and torturer rarely cared if words were true. The confession itself was the end sought, the stamp of legitimacy on an accusation. But the rack was far from alone. Iron boots, for instance, were designed to crush feet and shins by driving wedges between heated plates of metal. Thumb screws and finger crushers inflicted agony on smaller scales, sending waves of sharp pain through the body. The strappado, a method where a prisoner's arms were bound behind the back and they were hoisted into the air by a rope until shoulders dislocated, was as devastating to the body as it was to the spirit. In some dungeons, prisoners were lowered into pits of filth, suspended in cages where hunger gnawed as birds pecked at exposed flesh, or subjected to whips that tore skin with every lash dot. The horror of these punishments was not simply in the pain, but in the anticipation. A prisoner might be left in his cell knowing the torture chamber awaited. The groan of a door opening down the hall, the heavy footsteps of guards, or the dragging sound of chains could freeze a man's heart before a single blow was struck. For some, the dread of what was to come was worse than the torture itself, and in this sense, the prison magnified cruelty by transforming time into a weapon. It is important, however, not to exaggerate. Torture was not applied casually to every prisoner. It was expensive, it required trained personnel, and it risked death before confessions could be obtained. It was often reserved for those accused of treason, witchcraft, heresy, or crimes deemed especially dangerous to authority. Still, its presence haunted every dungeon, a shadow that hung over every captive. To sit in the darkness and know that somewhere, behind a locked door, men screamed under the rack was enough to carve deep scars into the minds of all who heard. For many prisoners, the dungeon was a liminal space between body and soul, law and pain, silence and confession. Guards and torturers became figures of nightmare. Jailers wielded not just keys, but power over whether a prisoner's suffering would be quick or prolonged, whether scraps of food arrived, whether chains were tightened or loosened. In a society where social status defined every relationship, prisoners of low birth often endured harsher treatment, while nobles might secure more merciful handling, though not always. Even a noble could feel the full force of torture if accused of betraying king or church. Religion once again played its role in this theater of torment. Torture was justified not only as a means of extracting truth, but as a cleansing fire. Priests sometimes stood by during torture sessions, urging the prisoner to confess sins and speak truth for the sake of his eternal soul. Pain, in this twisted logic, became a tool of salvation. Some even argued that since the body was temporary, its suffering mattered little compared to the redemption of the immortal soul. To a prisoner writhing beneath iron and rope, such reasoning was unlikely to bring comfort, but it revealed how deeply ingrained these practices were in the medieval worldview. The torture chamber, however, was only part of the system. Once punishments were administered, prisoners were often returned to their cells, battered and broken, to linger in darkness. Some survived, carrying the marks of their ordeal for the rest of their lives. Others never rose again from the stone floors, their bodies quietly removed and buried in unmarked graves. The cycle of imprisonment, pain, and death continued with unyielding regularity. Yet we must also consider the quieter cruelties, the punishments that lacked spectacle but corroded the soul. Solitary confinement, for example, was a form of torture in itself. Days, weeks, or even months in utter silence, in complete darkness, stripped prisoners of their sanity. Without human contact, without sound beyond the drip of water or the scurry of vermin, the mind turned inward and often collapsed. Hallucinations, paranoia, and despair gnawed at men until they no longer knew if the world outside still existed. The medieval prison was not built for rehabilitation. It was not a place where wrongdoers were transformed into better citizens. It was an engine of fear, a warehouse of pain, and a reminder to all who lived in its shadow that disobedience came at a cost. Its chambers of torture, its cells of darkness, and its instruments of mutilation served as symbols of a society that valued obedience above freedom, order above mercy, and spectacle above compassion. What is perhaps most striking is how quickly these horrors could be forgotten. For the free citizen walking past a jail, the suffering inside was distant, muffled by stone walls and habit. For the guards who enforced the system, cruelty became routine, another day's work. And for rulers and churchmen, the prison was a necessary tool, unpleasant perhaps, but indispensable to maintaining the order of the realm. The prisoners themselves, their stories, their screams, and their final breaths were rarely recorded. They slipped into silence, buried in unmarked graves, remembered only through whispers, rumors, and the faint echoes left behind in the annals of law. As we continue through this segment, it becomes clear that the forgotten horrors of medieval prisons were not only the chains, the torture devices, or the executions. They were also the everyday acceptance of suffering, the normalization of cruelty, and the silence that swallowed thousands of voices. The prison was not only a place, it was a culture, a system, and a worldview that shaped how entire generations understood crime, punishment, and justice. Inside the dungeon, time lost all meaning. Day and night blurred into the same unending darkness, broken only by the sound of footsteps, distant screams, or the clang of a metal door. For those imprisoned together, the cell became a small, twisted society of its own, one built on fear, necessity, and the fragile bonds between those condemned to the same fate. Not all prisoners were equal, even behind bars. The medieval world carried its hierarchies into every corner, and the dungeon was no exception. Nobles, when captured, often paid for better treatment, a cleaner cell, straw bedding, or food that was not crawling with insects. Some even brought servants, who shared their imprisonment but tended to their needs. The poor, by contrast, languished in filth and darkness, crowded together with thieves, debtors, and the condemned. There was no separation of crimes. A pickpocket could share a cell with a murderer, a political prisoner, or a heretic. Disease spread as quickly as rumor. In this world, alliances were fragile but necessary. A prisoner's survival often depended on their ability to navigate the small politics of the cell. Food, scraps of cloth, or a sip of clean water could be traded for protection or information. The strong dominated, the weak adapted, and the dying were left to rot in corners, their moans ignored by all but the rats that came to feed. Yet even in this abyss, there were moments of humanity. A stolen piece of bread shared, a whispered prayer, or a song sung softly in the dark reminded men and women that they were still alive, still capable of kindness in a place designed to crush it. The sounds of a medieval prison were as haunting as its sights. The shuffle of chains as prisoners moved in their sleep. The drip of water echoing through the hall. The scrape of bowls against stone when meager rations were handed out. Sometimes, above these ordinary noises, came the cries of the newly tortured, sharp, echoing, then fading into silence. For new arrivals, those cries were a grim welcome. For the long imprisoned, they were a reminder of what awaited anyone who defied their captors. The diet of the imprisoned was another form of punishment. Most prisoners subsisted on bread so hard it could break a tooth, and thin soup that was little more than warm water with a few scraps of vegetable. Meat was rare, reserved for those who could pay. Clean water was a luxury. Many drank from the same buckets used for washing or waste. Malnutrition, scurvy, and dysentery claimed countless lives long before the executioner's blade ever did. The few who survived for months or years often emerged thin, pale, and ghostly, their bodies etched with the marks of both hunger and despair. There was, however, one thing that thrived in abundance: stories. Prisoners told them to fill the silence, to keep their minds from unraveling. Some recited tales of saints and miracles, hoping for divine rescue. Others spoke of their crimes, whether confessed or denied, spinning them into grand epics that made heroes of thieves and martyrs of traitors. These stories, carried from one mouth to another, gave prisoners a sense of belonging, a fragile defense against madness. In some cases, priests or monks were imprisoned alongside common criminals, especially during times of religious conflict. They brought with them a different kind of presence, one that mixed faith with fear. Some led prayers in the darkness, offering spiritual comfort. Others broke under pressure, renouncing their beliefs to end the suffering. The cell thus became a strange confessional, a place where sin and sanctity mixed in ways that defied the outside world's order. Letters, if allowed, were rare and precious. A few prisoners managed to smuggle out scraps of writing through bribed guards or sympathetic visitors. These letters, often written in trembling hands, begged for mercy, confessed guilt, or pleaded for prayers. Many never reached their destinations. The act of writing them, though, gave the prisoner something vital, a voice, however fleeting, in a world that had stripped them of everything else. Visitors were few. Families could sometimes pay to see a loved one, but only for moments, and often through the bars of the cell. In wealthier cities, the prisons served as a grim attraction. Curious citizens or traveling nobles could pay the jailer to tour the cells and gaze at the condemned, much like animals in a menagerie. These visitors sometimes dropped coins to the prisoners, not from compassion but from fascination. To them, The dungeon was a warning brought to life, a dark mirror of society's cruelty and its order. Escape was rare, though not impossible. Some prisoners bribed their way out, convincing guards to look the other way during the night. Others dug through the walls with stolen tools, though most tunnels collapsed or were discovered long before they reached daylight. There were tales of miraculous escapes, a nobleman disguised as a servant, a thief who vanished into the sewers, a monk who claimed divine intervention. Yet for every escape, there were 100 who died trying. The walls of medieval prisons were not only made of stone, but of fear and futility. Despite everything, prisons were not always places of death. Some captives were released after paying fines, serving time, or surviving interrogation. Yet freedom rarely brought peace. Former prisoners often carried invisible wounds, nightmares, trembling hands, and the constant fear of being taken again. In some towns, freed prisoners were marked with brands or mutilations to signify their crimes. An ear cut off, a cheek burned, a hand missing. These marks ensured that even in freedom, the stigma of imprisonment followed them for life. Women, too, suffered in these prisons, though their stories were recorded even less. Many were accused of witchcraft, adultery, or heresy, crimes that carried both moral and spiritual shame. Female prisoners faced additional dangers: abuse from guards, isolation, and social scorn. Some gave birth in cells, their children born into darkness, never knowing the light of freedom. The cries of these infants were said to haunt the walls, reminders of a system that punished not only the guilty but the innocent born within it. Every medieval prison was different, yet all shared a single truth: they existed to break people. Whether through hunger, darkness, disease, or despair, the goal was the same: submission. In an age when law and religion walked hand in hand, to defy authority was to defy divine order itself. The prison was thus not merely a tool of justice, but a theater of moral instruction. The suffering of a few was meant to keep the many in line. And yet, amid the rot and ruin, humanity refused to die completely. A whispered prayer between prisoners. A song hummed softly in the dark. A stolen kindness, a cup of water, a shared crust of bread, all served as acts of rebellion. These moments, small and fleeting, were sparks of light in a world built on shadow. They were proof that even in the worst conditions, people sought to hold onto their dignity, their faith, and their hope. For the jailers, too, the prison took its toll. Years spent in darkness changed them. Some became cruel, hardened by routine. Others grew numb, performing their duties with mechanical detachment. A few, haunted by what they saw, turned to drink or prayer, unable to reconcile their work with their conscience. The dungeon consumed not only the bodies of its prisoners, but also the souls of those who tended it. By the late medieval period, whispers of reform began to surface. Scholars and clerics questioned whether endless suffering truly served justice. The idea of mercy, once a distant ideal, began to take root in some corners of the church. But for the vast majority of prisoners, these were distant debates. The dungeon doors remained shut, the chains stayed tight, and the world above continued, largely indifferent to the pain below. There was a point in every prisoner's stay when the body no longer rebelled, but the mind began to break. At first, they might count the days by scratching marks on the wall, or by measuring the slivers of light that slipped through cracks in the stone. But soon, even that rhythm failed. The days blended together in a haze of hunger and cold. The body adapted, but the mind began to unravel. Hallucinations came quietly. A prisoner might hear his name whispered when no one was there, or see faces forming in the damp patches on the walls. Some said they saw saints or devils hovering at the edge of sight. Others spoke to ghosts, old cellmates, long dead, holding full conversations as though they were still alive. To the jailers, this madness was no surprise. It was not just tolerated, it was expected. They believed that suffering purified the soul. The more a prisoner broke, the closer they came to repentance. Silence could be as cruel as torture. When the corridors were empty and even the rats seemed to hide, the dungeon became a place of complete isolation. The human mind is not built for such silence. It turns inward, dragging up memories and regrets like stones from a deep well. Prisoners relived their crimes, their betrayals, their final moments of freedom. They replayed them endlessly until the line between past and present blurred. Some prayed until their voices gave out. Others stopped speaking altogether, convinced that no one could hear them, or worse, that no one existed to listen. For many, the only company was the sound of their own heartbeat and the faint drip of water. There are accounts of prisoners who tried to end their own suffering, choking themselves with chains, smashing their heads against walls, even biting their tongues to bleed to death. Yet the dungeon seemed to conspire against escape. Death was slow, deliberate, and drawn out, as if the prison itself refused to let go of its victims. Those who were dragged out for interrogation often returned unrecognizable. Torture in medieval prisons was not constant, it was ceremonial. It was meant to extract truth, confession, or submission. Interrogators viewed it as a divine tool, a way to cleanse the soul through agony. The devices they used were simple but unimaginably cruel. The rack stretched limbs until joints popped. The strapado lifted victims by their wrists, dislocating shoulders with a single drop. The thumbscrew crushed bones with slow precision, and for every scream that echoed through the dungeon, there was always silence afterward, the silence of those who could no longer speak. What made it worse was that most torture was public, or at least semi-public. Officials and clergy would gather to watch, as though observing a ritual. They believed they were witnessing the hand of God forcing truth from the lips of liars. Some prisoners, broken by pain, confessed to anything asked of them, desperate for it to stop. Others refused, clinging to silence until they lost consciousness or died. Those who survived carried their deformities like living testimonies. A twisted hand, a crooked back, a missing tongue, each was proof of the dungeon's reach. And yet, in a strange way, torture was not considered cruelty but order. In a world where crime was seen as sin, punishment had to mirror divine justice. To the medieval mind, suffering was a form of moral correction. A thief who endured the rack without confessing might still find redemption through his pain. A heretic who repented at the edge of the stake was promised salvation even as the flames rose. In this logic, prisons were not places of cruelty, they were places of purification. The horror lay not in the brutality itself, but in how completely it was normalized. The dungeon, however, was not just a place of punishment. It was also a place of waiting. Prisoners waited for trial, for pardon, for execution, sometimes for years. This waiting was its own torture. Every sound could be the footsteps of a guard coming to deliver a sentence. Every silence could mean another week of uncertainty. Hope was both a comfort and a curse. Some prisoners clung to it, praying for miracles. Others learned to kill it, accepting that hope only prolonged the pain. There were moments of strange irony in these prisons. In some towns, the same priests who heard confessions in the chapel above would descend into the dungeon below to offer last rites to those they had condemned. Mercy and punishment coexisted, tangled beyond recognition. The church taught that suffering could wash away sin, and so the dungeon became, in their eyes, a dark chapel, a place where faith and pain intertwined. Some prisoners believed it too. They saw visions in their torment of angels, of light breaking through the darkness, of voices promising paradise. Whether these were divine or simply the mind's desperate response to agony, no one could say. But they gave meaning to pain, and meaning made the unbearable survivable. Over time, a strange rhythm took hold of life in the dungeon. Guards came and went, prisoners died and were replaced, yet the stone walls remained unchanged. A man could rot there for a decade and emerge to find the world outside, utterly different. Kings dead, wars ended, seasons turned. The dungeon was timeless, existing outside history. It was a world preserved in damp air and the stench of humanity, untouched by mercy or progress. Occasionally, someone did survive long enough to be released. Their stories were whispered in taverns and markets, tales of miraculous endurance. But these survivors were rarely the same people who entered. Some came out so weak they could barely stand. Others had forgotten how to speak in full sentences. A few refused to leave the prison grounds at all, choosing to stay near the place that had become their only known world. The sunlight hurt their eyes. The noise of the streets terrified them. The dungeon, in its cruelty, had become home, outside the prison walls. The rest of society carried on, largely unaware of the suffering beneath their feet. Merchants traded, children played, kings held feasts. Yet the prison served a purpose even then. Its existence was a constant warning. This is where disobedience leads. It kept order through fear, and fear was as powerful as the strongest iron lock. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing was not what the prisoners suffered, but how easily it was forgotten. Records were rarely kept. Names vanished. Graves were unmarked. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered old dungeon sites, they found bones still shackled to walls, rusted chains embedded in stone, and carvings scratched by hands long turned to dust. Desperate messages like mercy, Lord, or I am still here. Each one was a voice echoing across time, a final defiance against oblivion. Even among those who enforced the system, there were moments of doubt. A few chroniclers of the time, monks, scribes, traveling priests, began to question whether such suffering could truly serve God's will. They wrote cautiously, often under pseudonyms, fearing retribution. One anonymous text from the 14th century described a prison as a pit of souls, where men are stripped not only of flesh but of memory. Another lamented that the dungeon saves no one. It devours all. These whispers were the first cracks in the moral armor of medieval justice. By the late 15th century, ideas began to change. As Europe edged toward the Renaissance, new thinkers and jurists started to argue that imprisonment should reform rather than destroy. But these ideas were centuries too late for the countless men and women who had perished in the darkness. For them, the dungeon remained what it had always been, a forgotten corner of the world, where justice and cruelty were indistinguishable. The medieval prison, in all its horror, served as a mirror of the society that built it. It reflected their fears, their faith, their obsession with order. And while the walls have long since crumbled, the echoes remain in the modern world's solitary cells. in the debates over justice and punishment, in the uneasy awareness that civilization still finds ways to cage its own. The ghosts of those forgotten prisoners may never rest, but through the records, the ruins, and the whispered stories that survive, their suffering becomes more than a cautionary tale. It becomes a testament, a reminder that humanity's darkest places are not buried in the past, but live on in the corners we choose not to see. By the dawn of the 13th century, prisons were no longer hidden anomalies beneath castles. They had become a fixture of every major town in Europe. Yet not all prisons were the same. Each type had its own purpose, its own rhythm, and its own particular brand of misery. In the great stone fortresses of kings and lords, dungeons were symbols of authority. In city jails, they were instruments of law. And within the walls of monasteries and cathedrals, a quieter kind of imprisonment unfolded, one meant for the soul rather than the body. The landscape of confinement stretched from the icy towers of Scotland to the catacombs beneath Rome, and while each was unique, all shared the same truth. Once the door closed, the world above ceased to exist. Castle dungeons were perhaps the most infamous. These were the earliest and crudest forms of incarceration. Dark chambers carved directly into the bedrock below the keep. To reach them, one descended narrow spiral staircases, slick with moss and worn by centuries of boots and tears. The air was heavy with a smell that could not be described, only endured. Most castles were not built with prisons in mind. They became prisons through necessity. During war, rebels, spies, and hostages were kept below the Lord's feet, both to display his dominance and to keep danger close. The architecture reflected this philosophy. Cells were deliberately small, with no window, no drainage, and often no furniture except a rough plank or a chain bolted to the wall. Prisoners slept where they sat, ate what they were given, and dreamed only of sunlight. Those of noble birth fared slightly better. They might be locked in a tower room rather than a pit, allowed a servant, a bed, or even books. But even for them, confinement was a slow erosion. Letters went unanswered, seasons passed unseen, and the silence became unbearable. Some left carvings on the walls, crests, prayers, or poetry, as if to prove they still existed. In the Tower of London, many such inscriptions still remain. Ghostly messages from those who waited for execution or ransom that never came. For the commoners, conditions were far worse. In some castles, prisoners were lowered by rope into oubliettes' deep, narrow holes, whose name comes from the French word oubliette, meaning to forget. There was no ladder, no light, no escape. A single opening above allowed food, if any, to be dropped down. Most who entered these pits never left. The purpose was not to punish, but to erase. Yet the medieval world was vast, and prisons varied with the societies that built them. In bustling cities like London, Paris, and Florence, the local jails became centers of civic control. Unlike the isolated dungeon, these were crowded, noisy places filled with thieves, debtors, drunks, and political dissidents. Some were imprisoned for months awaiting trial. Others lingered for years simply because they could not afford to pay their fines. The Marshalsea prison in London was notorious for this. It held everyone from poets to paupers, each suffering in proportion to their wealth. Those with money could buy better food, private cells, even access to visitors. Those without shared straw floors with dozens of others, breathing in the same damp air until disease claimed them. Typhus and dysentery spread faster than any sentence could be delivered. Death was not a punishment, it was a daily occurrence. Debtors' prisons were a cruel paradox. A man who owed money could be locked away until he paid it, yet imprisonment made repayment impossible. Families often had to raise funds to secure a loved one's release, sometimes selling everything they owned in the process. The cycle of debt and confinement was endless, a trap designed less for justice than for humiliation. There were other prisons too, quieter, more insidious. Within monasteries and convents, the church kept its own system of punishment. Monastic cells were meant to correct wayward monks and nuns through isolation and prayer. But the line between penance and punishment was thin. Those accused of heresy, blasphemy, or forbidden study might find themselves walled into narrow chambers, known as infested cells, in peace. Though there was none to be found there, an infested cell might be no larger than a coffin, with a small slit for air and food. Prisoners could hear the chanting of monks in the chapel above, a cruel reminder of the world they had lost. Some were released after months or years. Others were left until the end of their lives, their bodies quietly removed and buried within the monastery grounds. The church called it a mercy, a way to save their souls from damnation. But to the prisoners themselves, it was indistinguishable from burial alive, perhaps. The most feared of all were the ecclesiastical prisons operated by the Inquisition. In these places, faith itself became a weapon. The accused, whether they were suspected heretics, scholars, or healers, were interrogated not just for their deeds, but for their thoughts. The cells were stark, the methods methodical. Torture was justified as a means of enlightenment, pain as the pathway to truth. Records from inquisitorial trials describe cells lit only by a single candle, extinguished at the whim of the interrogator. Prisoners were left in darkness to contemplate their guilt. Some were subjected to sleep deprivation, starvation, or blinding light. Others were shown the tools of torture and told the confession could spare them the worst of it. The choice was an illusion, one form of suffering or another. Yet not every jailer was cruel by nature. Many were simply doing their duty, bound by laws they did not write and faiths they dared not question. In some towns, guards shared their rations with prisoners or smuggled in scraps of bread when orders forbade it. There were flickers of compassion amid the cruelty human moments that defied the machinery of punishment. In Florence, one record tells of a jailer who was executed himself for aiding a prisoner's escape. His final words were said to have been, "Better to die free for mercy than to live chained to duty." Such acts were rare, but they remind us that even in the darkest corners of history, humanity refused to vanish entirely outside the walls. The people of the medieval towns lived in uneasy coexistence with their prisons. They passed by them daily, heavy stone buildings with barred windows and iron doors, yet few dared to look too long. The cries that escaped at night were reminders of justice being served, or so they were told. To speak against the system was dangerous. Sympathy for prisoners could be mistaken for guilt. So, people turned away. Life continued. Markets opened, bells rang, and behind those walls, men and women disappeared into silence. Some prisons even became strange forms of entertainment. Public executions drew enormous crowds. The condemned were marched from their cells through the streets, often barefoot and in chains, while onlookers jeered or prayed. For many, it was a moment of moral reassurance, a visible separation between the good and the wicked. Yet, as the heads fell and the bodies swung, there were always a few who wondered if justice and cruelty had somehow changed. places, the medieval prison system was less a network of buildings than a philosophy, a belief, that pain and confinement could cleanse the human soul. Each cell, each chain, each silent stone corridor was built upon that conviction. And though centuries have passed, its echo lingers. The architecture of control, once born in those damp chambers, still shapes how the modern world defines punishment and order. But before reform could ever take root, the prisons had to reach their darkest point, when suffering became so normalized that it ceased to shock. When human lives were reduced to ledger entries, when mercy itself was seen as weakness. That moment was still to come, and it would change the meaning of imprisonment forever. The medieval prison was not a place of chaos, as one might imagine, but of dreadful order. Within those walls, every breath, every movement, every flicker of hope was dictated by unwritten rules that shaped survival. The guards, the jailers, and even the prisoners themselves learned their roles in this small, closed world, a society of suffering where cruelty and compassion walked side by side. Each day began with sound, the clank of iron keys, the scrape of bolts, the low murmur of voices counting bodies that barely stirred. There was no sunrise for the inmates, only the torchlight that flickered through cracks in the stone. The first duty of the jailer was inspection. He would walk the corridor with a wooden staff, tapping each cell door. Sometimes he paused to listen. A silent cell could mean one of two things: peace or death. Either way, he moved on. In the larger city jails, mornings were the busiest time. Prisoners shouted through their bars, calling to friends in neighboring cells, or begging for news of the outside world. Rats scurried across the straw, fat from scraps of rotten bread. In the corner, a man coughed, a deep, hollow sound that echoed like a bell of doom. Sickness was a constant companion. Typhus, scurvy, and fever spread easily, carried by fleas, water, or despair. Water itself was precious. In many prisons, the supply was drawn from shallow wells, contaminated by waste. The stench hung in the air like smoke. Prisoners drank it anyway. Thirst cared nothing for purity. Food too was meat. A bowl of gruel, a hunk of black bread, sometimes moldy, sometimes alive with worms. The lucky ones received food from family outside. The unlucky traded what little they had for a crust. Trade was the lifeblood of survival. Inmates developed an underground economy that mirrored the world beyond. A button could buy a sip of wine. A nail could be exchanged for a candle stub. A handful of straw might be traded for the use of a wooden bowl. Everything had value, even a whispered prayer. In the worst prisons, the guards themselves joined in the market. They sold favors, an extra blanket, a visit from a priest, a message carried to a loved one. For the right price, a cell could become slightly less unbearable. The guards were not all monsters. Some were old soldiers, too wounded for battle, now earning their bread through service. Others were petty officials, ambitious but poor. Their pay was low, their work despised. Many saw the prisoners as less than human, easier that way, to ignore the suffering. Yet even the hardest among them sometimes faltered. A song sung softly in the night, a letter written in trembling script, could remind them that those behind the bars were once like them, fathers, daughters, craftsmen, farmers. Still, power was intoxicating. To hold the keys meant control over life itself. A kind jailer might be respected, but a cruel one was feared, and fear was more useful. Some guards beat prisoners for amusement, or withheld food to break their spirit. Others found darker pleasures. Chronicles from the 14th century speak of jailers who kept wives of the cell, female prisoners coerced into servitude, or worse. It was a secret shame of the system, buried beneath the silence of the walls. But even in this darkness, strange relationships formed. There were stories of prisoners befriending their jailers, offering to mend their clothes, telling stories to pass the time. Some even shared their faith, a Bible passed hand to hand, a candle shared in prayer. When one prisoner died, it was often the jailer who closed his eyes, whispering a quick blessing before moving on to the next cell. Life was cheap, but not entirely meaningless. Time behaved differently in prison. For those inside, days stretched endlessly, blurring into one another. There was no sense of morning or night, only hunger and fatigue. Men marked time by the growth of mold on the walls or the number of rats born in the corner. Some scratched calendars into stone, counting days toward a trial that never came. Others stopped counting altogether. The outside world faded first from memory, then from imagination. Madness was common. In complete isolation, the mind became its own torturer. Some prisoners spoke to shadows, hearing voices that weren't there. Others sang the same song over and over until their throats bled. The jailers called it the silent sickness. There was no cure except freedom, and that came rarely. A few were released, not because they were pardoned, but because they were too broken to stand trial. They wandered out into the sunlight like ghosts, unable to bear the brightness of the world. The worst cells were beneath ground level, the pits. Water dripped constantly, collecting in shallow pools. Prisoners chained to the walls stood ankle-deep in filth, their skins soft and pale like wax. Rats were their only company. Some gnawed through their bindings. Others fed on the corpses of those who didn't. The air was thick, every breath a labor. In winter, the water froze. In summer, it festered. And yet, even here, some clung to hope, the hope of a letter, a pardon, or the simple mercy of a swift death. Executions were public, but deaths inside the walls were not. When a prisoner died in his cell, the body was often left for days. It was easier that way. Fewer trips to the gallows yard. When finally removed, the corpse was carried out under a sackcloth, nameless and unmarked. The living turned their faces away, not from fear, but from recognition. The dead were reminders of what awaited them all. Religion was both a comfort and a curse. Priests visited occasionally, offering confession or last rites. Some preached that suffering purified the soul, that a life spent in chains could earn eternal salvation. To the desperate, this was a small comfort. They prayed constantly, carving crosses into the stone, whispering hymns until their voices failed. Others rejected faith entirely, convinced that God had abandoned them in the dark. The walls were thick, but not enough to muffle their arguments. Some nights, entire corridors rang with prayer, others with blasphemy. There were moments, rare but real, when light broke through. A child born in prison, the laughter of a drunk who had forgotten his crime, a thief who shared his bread with a dying man. These flickers of humanity did not erase the cruelty of the system. They only made it more bearable. A monk once wrote, after visiting a city jail, that the souls of the damned shine brighter in their darkness than the righteous do in daylight. Perhaps he was right. For the jailers, life inside was no less consuming. They lived above or beside the cells, breathing the same foul air, haunted by the same screams. Some grew hardened, others numb. A few became drunkards, unable to sleep without the haze of wine. The line between captor and captive blurred over time. Both were bound to the same stones, condemned to the same monotony. When a prisoner died, the jailer lost not only a charge, but a part of himself, another life that had flickered out under his watch. Over the years, these prisons became small worlds of their own, complete ecosystems sustained by fear, trade, and ritual. Every inmate had a role. The strong protected the weak in exchange for food. The cunning bartered secrets. The silent prayed, and the hopeless simply waited. Waiting was, in itself, the hardest punishment. Occasionally, news from outside would reach them. A war ended, a king died, a plague swept the land. These events felt unreal, like rumors from another planet. Inside the walls, time moved differently. A man could enter as a youth and leave as an old man, stepping into a world he no longer recognized. The streets he remembered were gone, the people buried, the language changed. In that sense, release was its own kind of death. Yet the medieval mind saw all this as righteous. Justice was not about fairness, but balance, a cosmic scale that had to be restored. To suffer on earth was to cleanse the soul. The pain of the body was the price of moral failure. That belief allowed cruelty to exist without guilt, and perhaps that is why it lasted so long. People could accept any horror if they believed it had purpose. Still, not all prisons were destined to remain unchanged. In the centuries to come, new ideas would emerge: mercy, rehabilitation, human rights. But before those seeds could grow, the soil had to be soaked with centuries of sorrow. The medieval prison, with its darkness and despair, was both the birthplace and the grave of the modern idea of justice. And within that paradox, something strange happened. The very walls meant to silence human voices became their witnesses. Centuries later, when archaeologists and historians unearthed these ruins, they found scratches, carvings, words etched into stone, names, dates, prayers. The prisoners had left messages for a future they never lived to see. Messages that whispered, across time, a truth too human to be forgotten. As the centuries turned, something began to change within the medieval world. The same societies that once saw imprisonment as little more than a pause before punishment slowly began to question what purpose suffering truly served. It was not mercy that caused this reflection at first, but necessity. Prisons were becoming overcrowded, filthy beyond description, and expensive to maintain. The growing cities of Europe, London, Paris, Florence, Prague, were breeding grounds not only for commerce and learning, but also for crime. And so, even the harshest rulers began to see that endless cruelty did not cleanse a city. It only filled the graves. In the heart of London stood the most infamous of them all, the Tower, though today it is remembered as a monument of stone and story. In its prime, it was a living organism, pulsing with the misery of those who passed through its gates. The Tower was not merely a prison. It was a theatre of power. To be imprisoned, there was to be publicly shamed. Marked by the hand of the crown, its chambers held nobles, soldiers, heretics, and spies. Some left their marks on the walls, carved names, saints, family crests, pleas for mercy. Others left nothing, their existence erased as cleanly as chalk washed by rain. There was no single type of prisoner in the Middle Ages. The jail might hold a debt-ridden cobbler beside a bishop accused of treason, The same chains bound the guilty and the innocent. Yet status still mattered. A wealthy prisoner might rent a better cell, furnished with a bed and fire. He could pay for his own food and even hire a servant. The poor man beside him slept on straw and gnawed on scraps. Justice, it seemed, could be bought by the coin even in the darkest of places. The distinction between freedom and captivity blurred further through the practice of ransom and parole. Knights captured in war were not always chained. Their honor was their bond. They swore on their word to return if ransom was not paid, and remarkably, many did. Honor, to the medieval mind, was heavier than iron, but for commoners, there was no such privilege. A peasant who stole bread might spend years rotting in a dungeon, while a lord who killed in battle could drink wine by the fire that very night. Not all prisons were stone fortresses. Many were nothing more than small rooms attached to local manors or monasteries. In these places, the line between punishment and penance was thinner still. Monks served as jailers, confessors, and witnesses. They believed that confinement could purify the soul. A thief might be locked in a cell beside a chapel wall, forced to hear the chanting of prayers day and night, a reminder of the salvation that always seemed just out of reach. The sound of bells became both torment and comfort. Punishment itself often blended into imprisonment. A man might be chained in the public square for a week, exposed to the cold and the ridicule of passersby. Women convicted of petty crimes were sometimes imprisoned in cages, hung above rivers, visible to all, drenched by rain, humiliated by the eyes of their neighbors. These punishments were meant not only to harm, but to teach. The lesson was simple. Fear the shame more than the act that brought it. Inside the walls, the prisoners developed a language of their own gestures, knocks, secret codes. They found ways to communicate despite their chains. A cough could mean the guard is near. A whistle might warn of a beating to come. It was a fragile web of human connection, built out of desperation and instinct. For even when stripped of everything, people sought to belong to something, to anyone, as centuries passed. The world outside began to shift. Kings rose and fell. The plague swept through, killing millions and emptying jails as much as it filled graves. After such calamities, some rulers began to see imprisonment not as a moral failing, but as a social wound. When too many poor filled the jails, the problem no longer looked like sin, it looked like suffering. The first murmurs of reform began, not in the courts, but in the streets. Still, within the walls, little changed. The jailer's keys passed from hand to hand, but the sound remained the same. The smell of dampened straw lingered like a curse. A man imprisoned in 1200 might have recognized the same. Darkness in 1500. The medieval prison was timeless in its misery. Yet history, slow and patient, was preparing to turn the page in some corners of Europe. Thinkers began to question the moral purpose of cruelty. Scholars and priests debated whether punishment truly saved souls or merely destroyed bodies. The writings of men like Thomas More imagined prisons not as dungeons but as places of correction, quiet spaces for reflection and reform. It was a radical idea, born of faith and reason, and it would take centuries to take root. But it was the first breath of something new. Compassion disguised as logic. There were experiments. Some cities tried houses of correction, where beggars and thieves were put to work. Others built more humane cells, with light and ventilation. A few even allowed visitors, priests, physicians, and occasionally family. Yet even these improvements could not hide the truth. prisons remained places of suffering, their walls soaked with the despair of generations. The change was philosophical, not yet physical. The bodies were still in chains, even as the minds of lawmakers began to stir. And in the meantime, life within continued its slow, grim rhythm. Nights were the hardest. When the torches were extinguished, darkness became absolute. The prisoners lay listening to the breathing of their neighbors, the dripping of water, the distant barking of dogs outside. In those hours, memories returned sharper than ever. Men dreamed of fields they would never see again, of wives and children who had long forgotten their faces. The mind became a cruel mirror, reflecting everything lost. Some prayed, others cursed. A few told stories, tales of saints and devils, of miracles and monsters. These stories passed from cell to cell, growing richer and darker with every retelling. In a strange way, they became a form of survival. To speak was to exist. To imagine was to remain human. Among these stories were legends of escape. Every prison had its myths. The man who tunneled through stone with a spoon. The woman who disguised herself as a washer and slipped past the gates. Most were fantasies, yet some were true. The walls of certain prisons still bear signs of these desperate attempts. Half-dug holes, soot from hidden fires, markings of tools long rusted. Escape was rare, but hope never died completely. Even in the blackest dungeon, there was always one man who believed he could break free in time. The medieval prison became a symbol not only of punishment, but of power. Rulers used it to silence opposition. The church used it to suppress heresy. To be imprisoned was to be erased, a warning to others. And yet, paradoxically, those who suffered often became martyrs in memory. Their stories, written after their deaths, stirred the hearts of others. The prison meant to silence them, instead immortalized their voices. As Europe moved toward the Renaissance, the walls that once stood unchallenged began to crumble, both literally and ideologically. The printing press spread knowledge like wildfire. The Reformation shook the moral foundations of justice. People began to speak openly about cruelty and corruption. And though the prisons themselves remained dark, the world outside grew brighter. Too bright, perhaps, for the old shadows to survive much longer. The medieval prison did not disappear overnight. It faded slowly, absorbed into the fabric of modernity. Some were converted into workhouses, others into military forts. A few became museums, but in every city that had once known their presence, their ghosts remained, the faint chill in the air near old stone walls, the echo of iron striking iron, the memory of lives forgotten to this day. Archaeologists still uncover fragments of their world. Bones beneath the floor, rusted shackles, fragments of pottery. Each object tells the same story, that suffering leaves traces. The medieval world believed that imprisonment cleansed the soul, but in truth, it only left stains on the stones and in the human memory that no amount of faith or time could wash away. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. The prisons built to break people ended up defining them. Within those walls, the human spirit was tested beyond reason, and though most were crushed, a few emerged, scarred but unbroken, carrying with them the first whispers of compassion that would, centuries later, change the meaning of justice forever. The dawn of change rarely arrives with thunder. It comes quietly, like light creeping across a cold cell floor, inch by inch, unnoticed until it touches the face of someone who has forgotten what warmth feels like. By the late Middle Ages, the world that had accepted the dungeon as a natural part of life was beginning, at last, to question itself. The conversations were hesitant, almost guilty. How had a society that spoke so much of God allowed itself to become a machine of misery? In monasteries and royal courts, whispers turned into debate. Some argued that prisons should not simply crush the body but mend the soul. Others believed that mercy weakened order. Yet both sides agreed on one thing: the system was failing. Too many people were dying behind walls without trial, forgotten by the world outside. The cost was no longer measured in silver or bread, but in humanity itself. In England, France, and the Italian city-states, new kinds of records began to appear, not just of prisoners, but of their conditions. For the first time, chroniclers described what went on inside the jails, not as spectacle, but as tragedy. They wrote of wardens who grew rich from bribes, of children imprisoned beside murderers, of the sick left to rot. These were not sermons or edicts. They were the first faint acts of bearing witness. The pen was replacing the lash as a weapon of truth. Outside, society was shifting in ways that even kings could not control. The Black Death had torn apart the fabric of feudal life. Entire villages vanished, fields went untended, and labor became scarce. Those who survived found themselves in a world where survival alone gave them power. A man who had been a peasant before the plague could now bargain for wages. A woman widowed by pestilence could inherit land. With such change came a slow but certain awareness that even the lowborn had worth, and with worth came rights. However fragile, yet inside the prisons, time seemed frozen. Inmates still lived in darkness, sleeping shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by rats. Their bellies empty and their bodies covered in sores. The language of punishment remained the same: confinement, humiliation, control. Reform was a word for philosophers, not for jailers. And still, the spark of human decency found a way to survive. In the dungeons beneath Prague Castle, a single candle might be passed secretly from one prisoner to another, not for light, but as a symbol of defiance. In Florence, scribes in confinement carved poems into wood, verses of love and faith scratched by trembling hands. In the Tower of London, noble prisoners like Sir Thomas More wrote letters that would outlive their chains. It is strange, perhaps, that some of the most enduring words of hope were written in places built to erase hope entirely. The Church, too, began to shift its stance. While earlier centuries had justified imprisonment as divine correction, reform-minded clergy began to see it as a human failing to be remedied. Some monasteries opened houses of mercy, small spaces meant not for torture but for repentance. They were imperfect, sometimes harsh in their own way, but they were different. The idea of punishment as a path toward betterment was being born by the 15th century. Europe was changing faster than the stones of its prisons could crumble. Trade routes expanded, printing presses hummed, and art bloomed in places that had once only known the clamor of war. Painters like Giotto and Van Eyck captured the human face with compassion, and that compassion began to ripple through the culture. When artists showed beggars and peasants with dignity, it became harder to accept their suffering in silence. Slowly, society was learning to see not only its kings and saints, but its broken, its lost, and its imprisoned. Yet the irony of the medieval world was that every step toward light cast new shadows. As kingdoms grew stronger and bureaucracies more complex, the machinery of justice became colder, more structured. Laws multiplied. Crimes were catalogued. Punishment though less savage in spectacle, grew more systematic. The dungeon was not gone. It had merely learned to wear the mask of order. Behind the new walls of stone and policy, the old suffering continued, disguised as progress. Still, a few voices refused to be silenced. In Italy, jurists argued that prisoners should be fed properly, not because it was kind, but because starvation corrupted justice. In France, philosophers began to write that cruelty reflected not divine wrath, but human weakness. In England, the Magna Carta, centuries earlier, had already sown the seed that no man should be deprived of liberty without cause. Now, at last, that seed began to germinate. But if one walked through the prisons themselves, the Newgate in London, the Conciergerie in Paris, the Carceri of Florence, the scene remained bleak. Men still chained in pairs, women huddled with infants, disease festering in the straw. The guards, often unpaid, lived off the bribes of the desperate. A loaf of bread might buy a week without a beating. For the poor, freedom was not a verdict, it was a luxury. And yet, amid the despair, there were flickers of grace. Sometimes, a jailer would secretly loosen a chain. A priest would smuggle in a crust of bread. A prisoner would share his last piece of clothing with one who had none. These small acts did not change history, but they preserved something far more precious: humanity. It was in these unseen gestures that the true story of medieval prisons was written, not in royal decrees or dusty records, but in the quiet resistance of compassion. By the end of the 15th century, the medieval world was fading, but its echoes remained strong. The Renaissance had begun to speak of human worth in art, science, and philosophy. Yet in the dark corners of cities, the old cells remained occupied. The prisoners of this new age were different: political dissenters, thinkers, dreamers who questioned authority. And in their suffering, they became a bridge between the cruelty of the past and the conscience of the future. It is fitting, perhaps, that as the Middle Ages died, so too did the idea of imprisonment as simple vengeance. What replaced it was not mercy, not yet, but introspection. People began to ask why. Why punish? Why confine? Why destroy when one could reform? These questions would not be answered for centuries, but their asking marked the beginning of the modern world. And so, as we step back from those cold corridors and crumbling walls, we can almost hear the faint echo of 1,000 forgotten voices, some angry, some praying, some simply whispering their names so they would not vanish. They did not know they were shaping history. They only knew they wanted to be remembered, and in a way, they were. Every reform, every prison built with windows, every law demanding fair trial, all of it began in those silent, suffering chambers of the Middle Ages. The stones remain. In cities across Europe, you can still walk past them. The worn steps where chains once dragged, the heavy doors that once sealed, the cries of the condemned. They stand not just as ruins, but as reminders that civilization is not measured by its palaces, but by its prisons. For every generation must decide what justice means, and how much of its humanity it is willing to sacrifice in its name. And if you listen closely, in the cool air of those ancient cells, you might still hear the faint breath of the past, a sigh, a prayer, perhaps even a name, not of kings or conquerors, but of those who lived and died unseen, whose pain forced the world, at last, to remember what it means to be human. The story of the medieval prison does not end with the closing of its gates. It continues, quietly, in the minds of those who lived through it and in the societies that followed. The walls may have been built of stone, but the real prison was the belief that suffering was a necessary part of order. To change the dungeon, humanity first had to change itself. As Europe stepped hesitantly into the early modern era, a new kind of light began to seep through the cracks of history. It was not the flicker of torches or the cruel glow of judgment fires, but something gentler, the light of thought, of questioning, of conscience. The Renaissance had awakened a fascination with human potential, and that curiosity soon turned inward. What made a person good or evil? What could redeem the soul? For the first time, punishment itself became a subject of philosophy. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as kingdoms evolved into states and monarchies stretched their power through written law, a paradox took shape. On one hand, justice became more structured, crimes were listed, punishments defined, courts expanded. On the other, those very definitions forced society to look at its own cruelty. Torture chambers and dark cells had once been accepted as the price of order. Now, under the scrutiny of scholars, priests, and emerging philosophers, they began to appear barbaric. Relics of an age less civilized than people wished to believe they were. But the transformation was not sudden. It came slowly, like the shifting of seasons after a long, cruel winter. For every act of mercy, there was still a trial conducted in darkness. For every warden who showed compassion, another turned cruelty into profit. Yet something had changed. The stories could no longer be buried. The printing press ensured that suffering could travel faster than ever before. Accounts of prison life began to appear in pamphlets, sermons, and moral essays. People who had never seen a dungeon began to imagine one, and in imagining, they began to care. The religious movements of the age also played their part. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation were not just battles over doctrine. They were revolutions of conscience. Both sides, in their own way, turned their gaze toward the soul. Sin was no longer simply to be punished. It was to be understood, confessed, repented. This subtle shift from vengeance to introspection rippled through every part of society, including the prisons. Some monasteries converted their ancient cells into what they called houses of correction, places where labor, prayer, and silence would heal rather than destroy. The idea was imperfect, but revolutionary for its time. In England, the concept of debtors' prisons took hold, not because the people became more compassionate, but because money had replaced violence as the instrument of control. Those who could not pay their debts were confined until they could. It was an age that valued commerce and reputation, and poverty itself became a form of crime. For some, this was progress. For others, it was simply a new kind of cruelty wearing the mask of civility. To be poor in the 17th century was to live one misstep away from imprisonment, where disease, filth, and corruption remained as constant as ever. And yet, reformers appeared. In the cities of Amsterdam, London, and Paris, thinkers and clerics began to argue that punishment should serve a moral purpose, that confinement without education or hope was merely organized despair. Writers such as Daniel Defoe and later John Howard would make the conditions of prisons a public scandal. But even before them, lesser-known voices began to whisper the same truth. The society could not claim to be civilized while its prisons remained hell on earth. The transition from dungeon to reform was not only political, it was deeply human. In every century, there were those who could not look away. A guard who smuggled food into a cell, a monk who opened his abbey to the condemned, a noblewoman who sent clean linen to prisoners she would never meet. Small acts, lost to time, but together they formed the unseen foundation of change. The idea of mercy, once fragile and fleeting, began to gather strength as Europe entered the age of enlightenment. The conversation about justice became impossible to ignore. The philosophers, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Beccaria, spoke not of torture and sin but of humanity, reason, and dignity. Cesare Beccarius on Crimes and Punishments in 1764 would later ignite a fire that burned across continents. He argued that justice should never be about revenge, that the purpose of punishment was not to inflict suffering, but to prevent harm. It was a simple idea, but one that shattered centuries of cruelty still. Before such thoughts could bloom, the world had to pass through a long twilight. In the 16th and 17th centuries, prisons remained damp, crowded, and lethal. Chains clanked against the stone. Prisoners slept in straw soaked with their own sweat. Typhus spread like wildfire through the narrow corridors, earning it the grim name jail fever. Executioners and physicians often shared the same tools, but something about that horror began to feel wrong. Not inevitable, not divine, but wrong. People began to write about it, paint it, debate it. And that awareness, slow and painful as it was, marked the beginning of conscience. In the courts of Europe, rulers began to see the usefulness of order over terror. The public spectacle of execution, once a source of fear and entertainment, began to lose its hold. Crowds that had once cheered now turned away. Artists captured the faces of the condemned with sympathy rather than contempt. Justice was changing shape before the world's eyes. No longer could it be satisfied with the dungeon alone, but even as this slow revolution unfolded, the memory of the medieval prison lingered like a ghost. It haunted reformers and philosophers alike, a reminder of what unchecked power could do when left unchallenged. To erase the darkness, one had to remember it. That was the paradox of progress. That enlightenment could not exist without the memory of shadow. In that sense, every reformer who stepped into a filthy cell, every scholar who documented the cries of prisoners, was performing a kind of exorcism. They were naming the demons of cruelty so they could no longer hide behind piety or law. They were forcing the world to look into its own mirror and not turn away. In the 17th century, one of the first real steps toward organized prison reform came from an unlikely place: the Quakers. In England and later in the American colonies, they preached that every soul carried a divine spark, no matter how lost. They rejected torture, condemned violence, and envisioned prisons as houses of reflection rather than punishment. It was the birth of the idea that the prisoner was still a person, an idea both radical and fragile. The concept spread slowly, whispered through pamphlets and sermons, carried by merchants and missionaries across seas. The world was changing, and though the walls of the old prisons still stood, the beliefs behind them were beginning to crumble. Humanity, it seemed, was waking up and realizing, with some shame, what it had built in its name. If the medieval prison had been the darkest mirror of human nature, the early modern reformers were the first to polish its surface and force civilization to see its reflection. It was not a clean reflection, far from it, but it was the beginning of something different. The understanding that justice without compassion was merely another form of cruelty. And as the century turned, the dungeon began to die, not with a roar, but with a sigh, the slow, inevitable collapse of an idea that the world could no longer bear to believe. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe had begun to change in ways no one could have predicted. The same cities that once echoed with the clank of chains and the cries of the condemned were now murmuring with the voices of philosophers, writers, and reformers. The air was thick with ideas about freedom, reason, and the inalienable dignity of man. The medieval dungeon, with its darkness and rot, stood as a symbol of everything the Enlightenment sought to leave behind. But though the thinkers spoke of liberty and rights, the prisons themselves still whispered of the past. In the narrow cells beneath London's Newgate, men still lay on cold stone floors. In Paris's Bicêtre, women and children still languished in despair, punished for poverty as though it were a crime. Reform had not yet reached the depths of these walls, but the world outside was changing, and the walls could not hold forever. In the coffee houses of London and the salons of Paris, people were beginning to question the moral foundation of punishment itself. What made a man criminal? Was he born wicked or shaped by misery? These questions had once belonged to priests and theologians, but now they were debated by lawyers, pamphleteers, and scientists. Reason, the great banner of the Enlightenment, demanded that justice itself be reasonable. The prison, once a place of silence, was becoming a topic of conversation. Travelers described its horrors. Writers exposed its corruption. In 1729, the journalist Daniel Defoe, better known for Robinson Crusoe, wrote about the inhumanity of confining debtors, noting that many would die behind bars for sums no greater than a loaf of bread. His words were read in drawing rooms and taverns alike, spreading outrage among those who had never set foot in a cell. The idea began to take hold that imprisonment could not exist without accountability. Then came men like John Howard, a name that history remembers, though his mission was born not from fame, but from shock. In the mid-18th century, Howard, a county sheriff in England, visited the local prisons under his supervision. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rooms packed with starving men, no fresh air, no sanitation, and the constant stench of death. He saw men jailed not for crimes, but because they could not afford to pay the jailer's fee. He saw children born in chains and corpses carried out daily. Howard did not look away. He traveled across Europe, inspecting prisons in France, Italy, Germany, and Russia, recording every cruelty he witnessed. His findings were published in The State of the Prisons in 1777, a book that would shake the moral conscience of a continent. He wrote not with outrage, but with calm precision, letting the facts themselves condemn the system. His words were clear. If civilization could send men to die in filth and despair, then civilization itself was still in chains across the Atlantic. The colonies that would become the United States were beginning to grapple with the same questions. The Puritans of New England had already rejected the public spectacle of punishment, the stocks, the whip, the gallows, in favor of isolation and reflection. They built the first houses of correction, inspired by the Quaker belief that solitude could lead to repentance. It was a flawed idea in practice, often descending into psychological torment. But it represented something new, the belief that punishment could reform rather than destroy. Meanwhile, in France, the prisons of Paris overflowed. The Bastille, looming over the city like a stone monster, had come to represent not only tyranny but indifference. The men and women locked within were often forgotten writers. Paupers, the mentally ill, or those who had offended the wrong nobleman. When the French Revolution came and the people stormed the Bastille in 1789, it was not just a rebellion against monarchy. It was a rebellion against the very idea that human suffering could be hidden behind stone walls. The fall of the Bastille was, In many ways, the symbolic destruction of the medieval prison system itself. Yet even as the old order crumbled, the new one struggled to define what justice should look like. The Enlightenment had taught that punishment must fit the crime, but what did it mean to fit? Was justice best served through reformation, deterrence, or simple containment? Across Europe and the Americas, experiments began. New prisons were built not as dungeons, but as machines of morality. One of the earliest and most famous of these was the panopticon, a design proposed by the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. His idea was deceptively simple: a circular building where every cell faced inward toward a central tower. From that tower, a single guard could see every prisoner, but the prisoners could not see him. The uncertainty of being watched, Bentham argued, would make men discipline themselves. It was an architecture of control, rational and efficient, the opposite of the chaotic medieval dungeon. But there was a coldness in the idea, to an echo of the very cruelty it sought to replace. The panopticon was meant to bring light, yet it replaced compassion with surveillance. In its shadow, the modern prison was born cleaner, brighter, but still, in its essence, a cage. Not all thinkers agreed with Bentham's logic. In Italy, Cesare Beccaria had already argued that the true purpose of punishment was not to torment, but to prevent crime through fairness and education. His words, published decades earlier, were still spreading across Europe. "It is better to prevent crimes than to punish them," he wrote, a sentence that would become a guiding light for reformers for centuries to come. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the transformation gathered momentum. In England, Elizabeth Fry, a Quaker woman with no official power, entered Newgate Prison and changed everything she touched. She found women huddled in filth, many with infants born behind bars. Instead of turning away, she brought them food, clothing, and compassion. She organized education for the prisoners and demanded that they be treated with dignity. Her actions drew the attention of Parliament and even the royal family. Fry's quiet courage proved that reform was not born from authority, but from empathy. Prison reform spread across the Atlantic as well. In Pennsylvania, the Quakers established the Eastern State Penitentiary in 1829. A vast fortress designed for solitary reflection. Each prisoner lived alone in silence, with only a Bible for company. The architects believed that isolation would cleanse the soul, but time revealed another truth. Silence could drive a man to madness as swiftly as the whip. Reform, like all human invention, carried its own unintended cruelty. Still, the old medieval logic that punishment must be pain was fading. The darkness of the dungeon had been replaced by the austerity of the cell, the iron bars gleaming instead of rusting, the cruelty less visible but no less real. Society had evolved, but it still wrestled with its oldest question: could justice ever truly be humane? The memory of the medieval prisons, however, refused to die. Writers of the 19th century resurrected it in their art and literature, not as nostalgia, but as warning. Charles Dickens, who visited prisons and debtors' jails in his youth, wrote scathing portrayals of confinement in Little Dorrit and A Tale of Two Cities. His depictions of cold corridors and broken spirits reminded the public that cruelty was not a relic. It was a habit that could return if forgotten. Through such stories, the medieval dungeon became a symbol of the past humanity had escaped, or at least believed it had. The dripping stone walls, the rattle of chains, the echo of prayers whispered in the dark, they lingered in collective memory, teaching generations that progress must be guarded as fiercely as freedom. And yet, for all the reforms and enlightenment, the fundamental paradox remained. Prisons, no matter how enlightened, still depended on walls, locks, and the control of bodies. Civilization had changed the face of punishment, but not its heart. The dungeon had not been destroyed. It had merely been refined as the century turned once more. Reformers and philosophers continued to wrestle with this truth. Could society ever build a prison that healed rather than harmed? Could confinement ever be moral? These questions would echo long into the future, whispered in the corridors of justice systems that still carried the blood of their medieval ancestors. For every beam of light that entered the cell, there was still a shadow behind it. But humanity was at least aware of its own darkness now, and that awareness, more than any reform, was the beginning of true change. The world was learning, slowly, painfully, that mercy was not weakness, and that justice without compassion was no justice at all. And somewhere, in the ruins of an ancient fortress where once the cries of the condemned had filled the air, the wind now moved softly through empty halls. The chains were gone, the torches extinguished. Only the silence remained, not of despair, but of memory. A reminder that civilization is not measured by its laws, but by the kindness with which it enforces them. As centuries passed and the world marched into the age of steam, empire, and modernity, humanity congratulated itself on progress. The great cities that once hid their dungeons beneath palaces now built their prisons on the edges of towns. Grand in architecture, clinical in their order. The old darkness, it was said, had been banished by civilization. And yet, the same question that haunted every medieval jailer remained. What does it mean to punish? In the 19th century, Europe's prisons were transformed into monuments of control. The clanging of chains had softened, replaced by the rhythm of regimented footsteps and the scrape of iron keys. The cells were no longer dripping caverns, but narrow chambers lined with whitewashed stone. Each one identical, designed to strip away individuality. Reformers boasted of progress, cleanliness, order, silence, yet many who entered these modern prisons felt the same suffocating despair that had once filled the medieval dungeons. The light had changed, but not the feeling. Prisoners described the silence as unbearable, the solitude as maddening. In England's Pentonville prison, built on Bentham's panopticon principles, convicts spent 23 hours a day in isolation, their faces hidden behind cloth masks to prevent communication. They worked, ate, and prayed alone, forbidden even to whisper. Guards reported that many inmates began talking to themselves, pacing endlessly in their cells until they collapsed in exhaustion. Reform had promised moral awakening, but instead, it built an invisible cage within the mind. The same paradox unfolded elsewhere. In America, the Auburn and Pennsylvania systems competed for dominance, one favoring silent labor in groups, the other strict solitude. Both were praised as enlightened, yet both created new forms of suffering. A man could die without a whip ever touching his back. Society had merely replaced physical cruelty with psychological torment. The dungeon had evolved, but the darkness had adapted as the century wore on. Prisons became mirrors of the societies that built them. In industrial Britain, they reflected the obsession with efficiency and discipline. In revolutionary France, they embodied equality in suffering, every prisoner subject to the same cold uniformity. In Imperial Russia, where the vast Siberian landscape served as a natural fortress, exile itself became the new dungeon. Thousands of men and women were sent to labor camps in the frozen wilderness, their lives devoured by distance rather than chains. Yet through it all, the memory of the medieval cell endured. It was recalled in art, in religion, in nightmares. Artists painted hooded figures in torchlit corridors, their shadows stretching across the stone. Writers used the dungeon as a symbol of the soul's imprisonment, the place where man confronts his own guilt and his longing for redemption. The prison had become both a real and metaphorical truth, proof that civilization still wrestled with its own conscience. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had entered an age of steel and electricity, yet the human instinct to confine, to control, to punish remained untouched. Wars reshaped borders, kings fell, ideologies rose, but in every new nation, new prisons appeared. Some gleamed with the promise of modern justice. Others hid atrocities no less horrifying than those of the medieval age. In the Soviet Union, for instance, the concept of punishment took on a new face: the labor camp. The gulags, scattered across the frozen expanse of Siberia, were built not beneath castles, but beneath the banner of progress. Yet they echoed the same cries that once filled the medieval oubliette. Men froze, starved, and vanished, all in the name of ideology. It was a chilling reminder that cruelty does not vanish with education or technology, it only changes form. Elsewhere, in the heart of Europe, totalitarian regimes rediscovered the old methods of fear. The medieval dungeon, once hidden beneath fortresses, now wore a uniform and called itself the state. Torture chambers returned under new names, hidden in basements and barracks, proving that the line between civilization and savagery is far thinner than we dare admit. After the Second World War, the world again swore that it had learned. Human rights were declared sacred. The idea of rehabilitation replaced that of retribution. But beneath this new vocabulary, the same silent struggle persisted. Prisons expanded as cities grew, filled not with heretics or rebels, but with the poor, the addicted, the forgotten. In the medieval age, chains bound the body. In the modern one, bureaucracy bound the soul. Even in the most advanced nations, isolation cells, the descendants of the medieval dungeon, continue to exist. Solitary confinement remains a tool of control, despite evidence that it breaks the mind as surely as the rack once broke the body. It is not called torture, but it inflicts the same despair that echoed centuries ago. Through the damp corridors of castles long turned to dust, the past does not die easily. It waits in silence, patient as stone. And so we find ourselves today, in a world that believes itself enlightened, yet still haunted by the ghosts of the medieval prison. We no longer watch public executions. Instead, we bury our punishment in places unseen. The dungeon's darkness has been replaced by concrete, fluorescent light and surveillance cameras. The cold eye of Bentham's panopticon, now realized in technology. Every prisoner is still watched, still controlled, still rendered invisible. When we look closely, we realize that the medieval cell was never just a place. It was an idea, the belief that suffering purifies, that fear maintains order, that justice demands pain. That idea, though challenged by centuries of reform, still lingers in policy, in law, in the quiet acceptance of cruelty when we believe it necessary. But perhaps there is hope in remembrance. By telling the story of the medieval prisons, of their filth, their horror, their unrepentant cruelty, we confront the part of ourselves that allowed them to exist. Every era of punishment reflects its people. And by understanding the past, we can glimpse the mirror of the present. Some ruins of those old prisons still stand today, in castles turned museums, in monasteries turned monuments. Tourists wander through them, shivering not from cold, but from the weight of history. The air feels thick, the walls seem to hum with memory. You can almost hear the faint sound of chains rattling, the murmur of prayers in the dark. And for a moment, standing there, you understand that civilization is not a line from darkness to light, it is a circle. The same questions, the same fears, the same desires for control, return again and again, only dressed in new language and new walls. Yet there is another sound, too softer, easily missed. It is the sound of footsteps leaving the dungeon behind. The quiet persistence of reformers, thinkers, and ordinary people who refuse to look away. It is the sound of progress not proclaimed in parades, but whispered in compassion. The medieval dungeon taught humanity one brutal lesson, that indifference is as deadly as cruelty. Every chain forged in the name of justice must be examined, every wall questioned. The world may never be free of prisons, but it can strive to be free of the medieval spirit that built them, the spirit that found comfort in darkness. So when we walk through those stone corridors today, we should not only feel horror, but also responsibility. Those prisons are not relics. They are reminders. They tell us that civilization is fragile, that morality must be guarded like a flame. Because the moment we forget, the dungeon returns, not beneath castles, but within ourselves. And as the wind moves through the ruins of those old prisons, carrying the scent of moss and rain, it feels almost like a sigh. The sigh of centuries that have seen cruelty, repentance, and the slow, painful climb toward humanity. The torches have gone out, the chains are rusted, but the memory endures. A warning carved into the heart of time. The forgotten horrors of the medieval prisons are not forgotten at all. They live in our justice systems, in our fears, in our stories, and in our hope that we might one day truly outgrow them. Because only when we remember what it was like to live in darkness can we truly appreciate the light. Centuries pass, and the world forgets easily. Stones crumble, names fade, but silence remembers. When you step inside the ruins of a medieval prison today, perhaps beneath an ancient castle or at the bottom of a damp tower, the air feels heavy, almost alive. The stones seem to breathe. They hold something older than memory, the echo of lives spent in darkness. It's not the kind of silence that soothes. It's the kind that listens back. For a long time, historians treated these places as curiosities, relics of superstition and brutality, a sign of how far we've come. But the truth is more complicated. Every age builds its own dungeon. Every society convinces itself that its form of punishment is justified. In the medieval world, justice was a spectacle, a public ritual of pain that reaffirmed order. In the modern world, justice hides behind walls and words, yet both share the same root: fear. Fear of chaos, fear of difference, fear that without control, the world will descend into madness. The dungeon, in all its forms, feeds on that fear. Imagine the last prisoner ever held in one of those ancient cells. Perhaps it was the early 1600s. The Renaissance had already spread across Europe. Men were charting stars, building cathedrals, writing about human dignity. And yet, in that small, airless room, a man still sat in chains. His world had not changed. Progress, it seemed, had passed him by. He must have wondered what all that talk of enlightenment was worth when the night still came the same way slow, suffocating, endless. Outside, the church bells rang. Inside, he counted them not as hours, but as days lost. That man's name is gone, his crime forgotten. But the feeling he knew, isolation, fear, regret, still exists today, only in quieter forms, when someone is locked in a cell, alone for years. With nothing but a ticking clock and the hum of fluorescent light, he is living the same story. Time still drips slowly, like water from a medieval ceiling. The dungeon never truly disappeared. It simply changed its shape. And what of those who built them? The jailers, the executioners, the officials who ordered the punishments. Were they monsters, or just people convinced they were doing their duty? In many cases, they were fathers, husbands, townsmen who went home after a day's work and sat down to supper. They laughed, they prayed, they slept soundly. The horror of the medieval prison was not only in its cruelty, but in its normalcy. That is what makes history so unsettling. It shows us not just who we were, but who we still could be. When a society accepts cruelty as normal, the walls of the dungeon rise again, invisible, but no less real. They appear in prisons, in policies, in the quiet decisions that trade compassion for control. And every time a human being is treated as less than human, another brick is laid. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: many of those who suffered most in those dungeons were not criminals at all. Some were political prisoners. Some were heretics whose only crime was thought. Others were victims of circumstance, wrong place, wrong time, wrong belief. Their stories remind us that power, once granted the right to cage and torment, rarely stops at guilt. It consumes whatever it fears. In the medieval mind, the dungeon was not just a punishment, it was purification. To suffer was to cleanse. Pain was not cruelty, but mercy twisted into something unrecognizable. That belief is harder to kill than any institution. You can close the prisons, banish the torturers, write laws of rights and decency, and still, somewhere in the world, someone will argue that pain is necessary for redemption. The lesson of the medieval prison is not about architecture. It's about ideology. If you were to travel through Europe today, you would find these places standing in silence, under castles in France, beside monasteries in Germany, within the old towers of England, Italy, and Spain. They are tourist attractions now, lit with yellow lamps, marked by placards explaining their history. Visitors take photographs beside the old iron doors, marveling at how people could once be so cruel. But if you stand still and close your eyes, the distance between then and now feels small. You can almost hear the echo of boots on stone, the scrape of metal, the faint whisper of a prayer that went unanswered. Somewhere, deep down, the world remembers. And yet, even in those dark times, not every story ended in despair. There were moments of defiance, quiet acts of humanity that flickered like candles in the dark. A guard who smuggled bread to a starving prisoner. A priest who whispered a blessing through a keyhole. A prisoner who carved words of hope into the wall, knowing he would never see daylight again. Those small moments matter. They are proof that even when the world was built on cruelty, compassion still found a way to breathe. The medieval dungeon, for all its horrors, could not crush the human spirit entirely. When archaeologists explore those sites today, they sometimes find inscriptions scratched into the walls. Some are prayers, others are names. A few are drawings crude, desperate attempts to create beauty in a place meant only for suffering. one found in an old English prison, simply reads, "Remember me." That plea has echoed across centuries. It is the true voice of history. To remember is to resist, because forgetting is how cruelty returns. And that is why these stories matter. Not because they shock us, but because they remind us that progress is fragile, that empathy must be guarded. The dungeon may be ancient, but the temptation to build it again in different forms, under different justifications, will always exist, in every age. There are those who will argue that some people deserve to live in darkness. They will say it in the name of order, of safety, of justice. And it will always sound reasonable until the darkness spreads. So when we tell the story of the medieval prisons, we are not just looking backward, we are holding up a mirror. We see in those cold walls the reflection of our own fears and our own capacity for indifference. We see how easy it is to believe that cruelty can serve good, that silence can bring peace, that suffering can cleanse. But we also see the opposite truth, that compassion, even when powerless, carries more strength than any chain in the end. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of the medieval dungeon is not the iron gate or the whip. It is the small window, high on the wall, where light filters through dust. It reminds us that even in the deepest cell, light still enters, however faint, however fleeting it is there, and that light belongs to us. When we study the forgotten horrors of the medieval prisons, we are not glorifying the past. We are learning how to keep it buried. Every lesson carved into stone, every name whispered through time, is a warning to the future. Because history has shown us the dungeon never truly disappears. It waits, silent, for the moment humanity forgets what it means to suffer. But as long as we remember, as long as we speak of it, as long as we choose empathy over cruelty, the light will never go out. And that, perhaps, is the truest escape from the dungeon. Not breaking free from its walls, but ensuring they are never built again. So the next time you walk through the ruins of a castle, and you see that small barred window set high in the stone, take a moment, look up. The sky beyond it is the same one they once dreamed of. The same stars that shone on their suffering shine on our freedom. Remember them, not with pity, but with purpose. Because the walls that once stood to break the human spirit now stand only as monuments to it. And in that, the prisoners of the past have already won.